So I'm Becky Maden. I work with UVM Extension, primarily on soil health and nutrient management. I come at this all from a farming background though. So I've only been with Extension for about 5 years. And prior to that, I was a commercial vegetable farmer and still have a farm with my family. Before we get going, I just wanted to offer a land acknowledgement on the note of the land I'm on is unceded Abenaki territory, and just want to offer gratitude for being on the land, being a guest on this land, and being able to farm. Our schedule today, I'd love to have you guys direct the conversation as much as we can in this virtual environment with conversation, discussion, and questions. But the general frame of it is going to be, I'm going to offer some background in soil health, nutrient, like how nutrients play into this. And then our two guest speakers are going to go. So Patrick Sullivan from Ananda Gardens in Montpelier and Hillary Martin from Diggers Mirth Collective in Burlington, Vermont. And then at the end, the last chunk of time is really going to be digging into the math and the soil test interpretation and calculating amendments. And if you've brought soil tests, we can try to use some examples. But during that time is really when we'll do the numbers. And I set it up that way, so if that's not appealing to you and it's not your style, you can take a break. But I'm hoping we have lots of time for conversation and questions at the end. So that's the layout, hopefully not too long. And I know Anna already asked a little bit in the chat, but no pressure. But if you feel like offering some of your perspective and background, I'd be interested in farm-wise acreage, what tools you're currently using to manage soil health, and specifics like mulching, cover cropping, tarping, how you're evaluating your soil health, and along those lines, what are your specific challenges? And then down to like kind of the last chunk of time here, how are you taking soil tests and how are you using them to inform your soil health decisions, if at all? So feel free to answer any or all or none of those questions, but I just think it's nice to kind of, even though we can't necessarily have a robust conversation here, but to understand a little bit more what you want to get out of the next couple hours. To offer this as a workshop on a really complex system is kind of an understatement, but the more and more I delve into this work from an extension perspective, the more and more I understand that there's all these different pieces and ways of knowing that come into play. As a farmer, I approach soil very much from a practical management standpoint and kind of learned as I went, you know, by being on a tractor and planting and harvesting and touching the soil, being in it. I feel like I've gained a intuitive sense of things. And then I got thrown into this extension work and was like, oh crap, like I got to do all this math and figure out nutrients and stare at soil tests a lot. And now I feel like I'm finally pulling back and thinking of this more as like the integration of all those pieces of research, of data, of intuition. And ultimately, I keep coming back to leaning on farmers to offer the most important knowledge. And whether that be my former mentors or farmers I'm working with now, or even my partner, I feel like that we have a lot of embedded farmer knowledge that's really important. So that's why I want to bring everyone in this room into the conversation. We know that healthy soil is not just a soil test and has all these components. I'm sure you've seen this graphic before, but I will say that I feeling incredibly ignorant about soil biology in the last couple of years. I took a really intensive class. Caleb knows this professor, but it was on soil ecology. And these two parts, on these two pieces, air and water, are just so fascinating from a like soil ecological perspective and what's living in the soil and how those elements really, really impact soil health blew my mind. So this little cartoon about pore spaces, you can take a column of soil, calculate out what size pores are in there and who's probably living in that soil, like pore space density, etc. So it's really, really important to manage those things. It made me understand more scientifically why compaction, tillage, and organic matter are all incredibly central to soil, healthy soil. So again, this is helping me personally pull away from kind of the calculations and soil tests and understand this more holistically. And you all know this, these key soil health practices and what we're going to be talking about today. So nutrient management, cover crops, tillage, and then minimizing erosion and soil loss. From a quantitative perspective, we know we need these three types of measures. So the physical, the biological, and the chemical. However, it's hard to pin down those first two, the physical and biological. What you're looking at here is the Cornell Soil Health Test. And that is one attempt made in a lab to quantify these other characteristics. And it's a useful test. We can talk about it more from a practical standpoint, but really it's the chemical tests that we've leaned on for a long time, partly because they're affordable, they're easy to do, and kind of offer a little more familiarity to us. But we can't ignore these other two things, and however we're measuring them, whether it's through observation, through crop yields, whatever indicators you're thinking about right now, or through some other metric like a soil health test, we can't lose track of those two things. Now, familiar with this university soil tests, and this is what we've been measuring for a long time, right? This is what kind of conventional systems and extension and universities have been leaning on. So these tests measure pH, nutrients, usually organic matter, and are a metric that we can hold on to over time and track. If there's nothing else you take away from today, I'd offer that sticking with the same soil lab over time is really important, and also taking a soil test around the same time of year is also very important. There's other types of soil tests to use. We're mostly talking about the standard soil test today, but I don't want to gloss over too much the importance of other pretty affordable and really useful soil tests. So the pre-sidrous nitrate test is used to capture the amount of available nitrogen in the soil any given time. And Hillary will touch on this probably in her talk, but because nitrogen is ever changing in the soil, it's not measured on a standard soil test. And it can only be captured in this pool of available nitrogen accurately. So it's not predictive and it's not like historical. It just gives you a snapshot in time, but it can be really useful if you're wondering where things are at and if you should side dress, for instance, or what's been available from a cover crop. Tissue sampling is really useful for perennials or berries, maybe a longer term crop like a tomato. And it tells you what the crop is actually taking up from the soil. So again, like in the case of a blueberry, you're probably less concerned about what's actively happening in the soil and more concerned about what the plant is getting when it's been in there for a long time. And finally, these saturated media tests are what help inform a high tunnel test. I've been doing a lot of work on those. Probably won't have a ton of time to talk about them today. I saw somebody put in the chat that they want to understand better their tunnel tests. The saturated media test tells you what's in a water-based extract solution, and it'll also used for potting media. So when you add water to a soil, what becomes immediately available for plant uptake? That used in conjunction with the standard or reserve soil tests helps to predict what's happening in a tunnel scenario really nicely. So, and the more and more I get into this, the more and more I'm like, science is like such a kind of arbitrary set of numbers that we're working with. So recommendations are just estimates, and they are based on science. They're based on field tests that have been done about crop response to added nutrients. And they've been done in our climate. So there is some context and a lot of value in these recommendations. What you see here is the New England Vegetable Management Guide, which helps populate the University of Maine soil test recommendations. But these are done on a field scenario, on a kind of a conventional planting system. So, 5 or 6 foot bed centers, 3 or 4 crop rows in the bed. So the plant density per acre is what you would imagine on like a larger market farm or yeah, several acres or more. If you're somebody who's planting like high intensity no-till, you might have higher nutrient demands. You're just asking for a lot more from the soil. So again, these numbers are based on a certain system and a certain understanding, and it changes and it's variable, and it also depends a lot on your soil and history. So these are the best baseline we have to work with. I lean on them a lot for a starting place, but they're not the end all be all. And along those lines, soil analysis is also not a perfect science. What's happening in the lab is they're using a certain extract to pull out a pool of nutrients, and those are the numbers that you see on your soil test. It's not like there's a discrete pool of available and unavailable nutrients in your soil. It doesn't work like that. Things are always changing based on temperature, the enzymes in the soil, the biology, and the extracts also differ. So University of Maine, Vermont, a lot of New England uses Morgan's, or we use modified Morgan's, and that is extracting more nutrients. So the numbers you see on your soil test are higher. Whereas if you looked at like Waypoint Lab or some of the other labs in the Midwest use these Malix, it's just a different acid extract and a different set of numbers. It doesn't mean anything different if you're using the same thing over time, but it's hard to compare them. It's like if you weighed yourself in kilograms for 10 years and then you hopped on the scale and looked at the pounds, the number is really different, but it doesn't mean your weight has changed necessarily, but you have to kind of compare the like metrics over time. So people often send me tests that are Malix and I'm like cross-eyed. I have no idea what it means. And forgive me for this kind of like capitalistic analogy, because not the system I really want to perpetuate in terms of soil health, but I think there's some value in understanding that your reserve nutrients are like your bank, and then the soluble nutrients are your, I know this is kind of dated too, who uses ATMs that much, but so you've got minerals hanging out in the reserve pool, and they're coming into solution and then going back into the bank over time. So you're depositing, you're taking out. And this is kind of biologically mediated, right? Organic matter, same thing. It's mineralizing and it's immobilizing. What your plants can get is in the ATM. So there's a pool of available nutrients at any given time, but then there's these reserve nutrients. So your soil holds on to this pool, and then the conditions change things so that the available pool is there for your plants. And same with the cations. So again, kind of a cheap analogy, but just to understand that there's different things happening at any given time. And then this is a really simple graphic, and you've probably seen this before, but I like to come back to it from almost like a financial or effort perspective too. But your soil test tells you, right, you've got your low, very low, low, optimum levels on the soil test. And then your yield is what you ultimately probably care about at the end of the day. And these are your inputs, your nutrients you're adding, whether it's in the form of compost, manure, cover crops, or a bagged amendment. What your soil test recommendations offer is this, a critical soil test level. If you add anything beyond that, based on like these studies that have been done repeatedly, you're not going to get a yield bump. So this is all like money and time wasted in potential environmental contamination. So you don't want to be adding nutrients beyond this level. There's no crop response. Down here is where you're getting the crop response. Now, I often run into farmers who are taking over a hay field that's in kind of lousy condition. It hasn't been, amended for years, and it might be down here. The soil test levels are all very low for the nutrients. And we calculate out what they might want to add, and it's like $2,000 to get up to here. And there's a little bit of a panic, and I feel really bad. So then we say, well, what if you just added a little bit and you got up to here? That's a pretty good bump in yield, and you might be really happy with that. So you don't have to follow the recommendations to a T. You can go part way. Whatever you're happy with yield wise is where things ought to be from kind of a yield input perspective. And again, this is breaking soil health down into a very like teeny little element, but that's just something to remember when you're adding nutrients, and also to remember that more nutrients is not always better. You might be building up reserves, but you might also be causing some problems with leaching or water quality contamination. For a lot of years, I've been a little perplexed by soil tests. Before I started this work, I would probably get one and then ask somebody who knew more than I did what to do. And often that was extension, and that's like a perfectly good thing to lean on, or asking Caleb for help is a great resource. But just to pull out the important things for you to flag as you're looking at them, the first thing I look at is pH. And that to me is like the easiest thing to change, the cheapest thing to change, and also one of the most important things. So we'll get into that in a minute. I also look at organic matter, which we all know you can feel good or bad about, but you want to keep an eye on that over time. It can indicate what your soil type is more than anything, but you really don't want it to be going down significantly. And then down here on the main test, this is where your macronutrients are listed in pounds per acre. That's the number that's being measured by that extract. And then I tend to kind of glance at the micronutrients and trace minerals. I know there's a lot of kind of schools of thought that put those kind of front and center, but for now, I feel like until we've all got our pH, organic matter, and macronutrients figured out, the micros, they tend to be okay in a field scenario. And as long as they're not crazy, I always check them, but as long as they're not frighteningly low or high, I tend to leave them alone, with the exception of boron. On a lighter soil, boron can go down, and sandy soil farmers often need to just add some boron routinely. And I'm totally open to like disagreement for different approaches, but pH, y'all are probably familiar with the importance of it, but I just wanted to reiterate that the reason why we want pH to be in a certain range is all the nutrients are informed by it. So the availability of everything you see here matters on depending on pH. If it goes too low, your nutrient efficiency changes, in particular phosphorus. So it's a little bit of a red flag. If I see a really low phosphorus on a soil test, I actually look at pH, because I'm like, well, maybe we can just get their pH into a good range and more phosphorus will become available. And then just in case you don't know how easy it is to change pH, lime, it's affordable. It can get spread on. There's ag lime, which is the calcitic kind, and then dolomitic lime. So if you need magnesium, and you can put it on any time. Looks crazy. I was out there in this field the day this was happening, and I couldn't find my car, but you can do it anytime as long as the fields are dry enough. If you're a big enough farm, you can, it's actually cheaper to just have someone drive all over your fields, but you can also buy it in bags and spread it yourself. People are also liking wood ash. It's pretty cool. It's got all these other nutrients, loads of potassium. It's a good bang for the buck. It has about a third the liming impact as actual lime does. So it'll lower the pH, but not as quickly. It's kind of a good maintenance thing. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It lowers it much more rapidly, but it doesn't have as significant an impact on the pH. And just to kind of pull back from all these nutrient conversations, I really want to, I know everyone talks about organic matter, but I really want to just emphasize how critical it is and why it is valid to pay attention to it. It's doing all these things, right? To maintaining and improving soil structure, releasing nutrients, and promoting soil biological activity. And there's also these different pools. So on a soil test, you get your organic matter reading. On mine, it says 5 to 6% on my soil, which is like a really heavy clay. It's measuring all different pools of organic matter. The fresh stuff is really what drives things, right? So you've got your stabilized organic matter, the living, which is like earthworms and bugs, like things that are actually living roots. The fresh residue, which is like the juicy, whether it's crop residue or fresh cover crop. And then that active decomposing organic matter. So I think in the past, I always thought of organic matter as those two on the right, the fresh and the active, but the other two, the living and the stabilized, are also like pretty big portions of the pie. And that's why my clay soil measures so high, because I think it has a really high level of stabilized organic matter and not much of the others. So it's not actually doing much for my soil biology and my crop yields. It's a pretty heavy soil that's hard to get anything to grow in, even though it looks really good on a soil test. And this is how it would look, right? You've got these different cycles, and this is over like a short time frame or a long time frame that it's moving into these stabilized conditions. So y'all probably know this, but it's just like, it's not as simple as just that number. When they take the soil organic matter number, they're burning it off and they're not fractioning it out. So they can't necessarily tell you from a standard soil test what type of organic matter you have, but you as a farmer probably know this and could probably tell me what portions of your organic matter are actually active and what are not. I don't know how I'm doing for time. If Patrick, you want to jump in? Is this a good time for you?
Sure, I can start. That was a picture of me. Do you want to, I'll see if I can share my screen.
I'm also happy to pull it up if you want, Patrick.
Okay. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. So, I made a little presentation of our soil health journey. That was a lot of great information that Becky gave us. Yeah, she's a wealth of information, and I really am grateful that I can kind of share some about our journey and what we've learned and how it's going for us. So this is our farm. We're in central Vermont. The farm has changed a lot since this photo was taken, but it'll give you an idea. It's a 14-acre field, and our main gardens are about 2 acres. 1.5, yeah, maybe more like 1.5 acres. We have 4 big greenhouses, and then, you know, what we've done is decided to focus our energy on building the soil up in the 1.5 acre main gardens rather than trying to crop the whole field. And I think, you know, it came from my interest in small scale, really intensive agriculture is just kind of where I've always been most interested. So probably when we first bought the property, we just cover cropped those 2 larger main gardens. And our second year, we moved here and started applying some, you know, lower levels of compost. And the past 3 or 4 years, we bought this property in 2017. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've been adding, you know, huge amounts of compost. So here's more what our gardens look like now. I think this was taken last spring, so close to, yeah, probably 10 months ago. And, you know, most of the food that we produce is coming out of each of these gardens in front of us are about 1/2 acre. So honestly, like, other than the greenhouses, most of the food we're producing is coming out of those 2 plots. And we are able to provide 150 family CSA for 8 months a year and do wholesale. And us, I graduated with a degree in geology. That, now this topic of soil health is like my favorite subject in the world right now. So I appreciate getting to speak a little bit about it. My wife is a health coach, so we also are really interested in the relation between soil health and our own health. I have about 15 years of farming experience. I also went to the UC Santa Cruz Farm and Garden Apprenticeship in 2010, which really informed, I think, a lot of the ways I farm, because we were farming on a small intensive scale there. And as an undergardens, we're in our 7th growing season. 5. This is our fifth or sixth year living full time on our farm. This is a photo of our family. So we're raising our 2 girls on the farm, and that's my wife Melissa. She does the sales and CSA customer service. So without her help, we definitely wouldn't still be in business. It's such an important part of making the platform to work on soil health, is figuring out how to sell our products and communicate that message well to our customers, why they should be buying from us, what benefits it has for the community, and hopefully their health. So my main message is that, with what we've found, making a huge investment in your soil will be the best money and effort you ever spend on your farm. It's just, I like that bank metaphor a lot. I feel like we just, when we purchased our farm is like sitting on top of a gravel pit. If you dig down 3 or 4 feet, there's so many small rocks and gravel, and it's very sandy. So putting a huge amount of organic matter is just like taking our bank account from $1,000 to $1 million. It feels like, as far as potential crop yields, ease of work, and our resiliency in the face of these different weather events, whether they be drought or really heavy rain. Our soil just tends to perform so well. It feels like we have so much more flexibility. You can almost not, you don't have to get everything right all the time in order to get a great yield. There's so much resiliency in the system that it's able to compensate for drier conditions, heavier rains, maybe not ideal fertilization program, spacing. We tend to space really close and we still get really good yields. So there's like so much flexibility. The main things that we've come across are compost. There on the photo on the right, you can see like how we bring our compost in on dump trucks down the lane between the greenhouse and the main garden, and dump it in piles there on a big cement pad that was here when we purchased the farm. And then we can scoop it up from there. Mulch, I think I'll talk about it a little bit, but that's something we want to get more and more into. Cover crops, farming practices, and then also really healthy crops. That's something that I've been learning more about recently, that there's nothing like a living plant photosynthesizing really well to help build our long-term soil fertility. So let me see. So our soil health is really the source of our available nutrients for crops. You can see just how our soil did not look like this. I wish I had a picture of what our soil looked like our first year, but these are more from the last couple of years. Just so aggregated, dark color. We've essentially turned our soil into a loam. I had a really interesting experience when I went to our first year here. We were growing such small onions, and it just felt like crop health was below what I wanted it to be. And I went to dinner at a neighbor's house, and he had a raised garden out behind his house, and such rich black soil, and just these like monster summer onions. And I just thought to myself, like, why can't we just like turn our farm into a raised bed garden? The yield seems so high out of that little space. And now, like 3 or 4 years later, that's essentially what we've done. We have been spreading like 200 to 250 yards of compost to the main 1.5 acre garden area over the last 3 to 4 years. And we were able to do that. We also, we kind of grew at the same time as a local compost maker. So because we were buying in such big quantities, we were able to get a pretty good price. It's really quality compost, animal-based manure mixed with other materials. And this, I think last year was probably the last year we'll spread such an amount on the gardens that are already built. We're going to be transitioning away from that, but this was like the big reboot in our system, or the big upgrade to our system. We get basically that amount, which each one of those piles is something like 18 yards, 15 yards. And we spread it, like do one big push in the spring and one big push in the fall. This is how we spread it in the garden on the right. I really like that method. I just drive over with the tractor and dump each one of those as a tractor bucket. It's pretty easy to spread that way, and limits our use of wheelbarrows. The picture on the left is us spreading with wheelbarrows. If we have a garden that's already made and I don't want to drive all over it, that's how we're doing it. We just have 3 wheelbarrows stacked right up next to each other, and everyone can get out of the area because eventually a wheelbarrow will fall over. So everyone's kind of clear and safe, and I just dump it in with a tractor. It's pretty hard work, but we trade that essentially, like we're front loading that work, saving work later. This is, I see maybe some of the texts are not showing up entirely. Apologize about that, but this is a pretty funny photo. On the left is the beginning of the year, and on the right is the end of the year. Like by the fall, our team is pretty sick of spreading compost, like getting a little loopy. On the left would be that's an area where like building up slowly, spreading a little bit of compost. And on the right would be a more typical amount of compost we're spreading on our main gardens. So it's like 6 inches thick, what we're generally doing. The mulch, we're using wood chips. I really like using wood chips in the path. We also use wood chips all around the perimeters of our garden and our greenhouses, inside the greenhouses. We don't mix it in with the soil, we just lay it right on top. And yeah, see so many worms, so much fungus around our gardens. Occasionally it's a problem if you're harvesting greens, that you get some woody debris in there, so that's something to consider. Last year on our main garden where we grow salad greens, we did not lay wood chips, but kind of the rest of the area we do. And yeah, but maybe more like 120 yards annually. A couple years we've gotten 2 loads. We can get them from basically a huge operation. They come in a tractor trailer and dump them anywhere we want. If anyone has any questions too, feel free to put them in the chat. And yeah, Becky, if you have anything to add too, can also chime in at any time. So this is our mulch. Something I've been learning more about is the fungal and bacterial relationship that I think we want to have a, not just bacterially dominated soils. So mulch really helps with that. We want to use more mulch, and we prefer to cut it and let it dry on the surface. And I think that that has benefits for long-term soil fertility and water retention, the myriad of benefits of mulching your soil. Let's see here. Okay. This is, I think this is a photo Becky took of a mixed cover crop. Has a ton of species in there. Was just buzzing with bees the whole summer, and that it was an area we were like getting ready to start farming. So we grew a huge cover crop on there, laid it down, and spread compost on top of that. So we also, I think it's a little harder to incorporate cover crops into the intensive gardening system, but kind of any opportunity we're looking for ways to do that. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's nothing like living plants to really build long-term soil fertility better than these large applications of compost. The whole relationship with the plants, cultivating the bacteria around them in the soil, pumping carbon into the soil. I think you're building more of the long-term kind of portion of your soil organic matter with cover crops than with composting.
Hey, Patrick.
So, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's a couple questions about wood chips, like what kind you're using, what
Sure.
species, or hardwood, softwood, whatever.
I think we would prefer to use hardwood, but we're paying like $1,200 for a huge tractor trailer of wood chips, and hardwoods are like $1,500. So we've gone with softwoods. Hardwoods I think would be better, and we probably will in the future, but up to now we've just gone with it's like 80 or 90% softwood.
Actually, to the I misinterpreted the question. What's your species mix in the cover crops?
Oh yeah, see that too. This one definitely had peas, had mustard, had oats. We've been putting like a lot of turnips in. I don't think that there are turnips in that one. Buckwheat. I always was worried that different things flowered at different times, and what if something went to seed? But surprisingly, that hasn't been a problem for us. We're mixing buckwheat into most of our cover crop species now. They generally are not going to seed before we're mowing them. What else would have been in there? We're not using so much vetch just because it's so expensive, and we couldn't get it locally. We're using pretty much I've been buying a bulk order in the beginning of the year and then just making mixes depending on we're putting a lot of sorghum Sudan grass mixed with sunflowers, and some of those cooler annual species more in the summer. And then this would be more of a mix we're planting in the spring. I'm not sure if we'll continue, although the mustard attracts so many beneficials, and we have honeybees. I think they're able to make a lot of honey off this little patch, but the fumigating effects of the mustard, I'm not sure we'll continue to mix that in unless we have a specific problem. But basically just a mix of everything we can get our hands on. And I don't from the more that I read and hear, I don't think there's a limit to that. Some people are using 20 species altogether. Let's see. So the other thing that we've been doing is, this is on another part of our farm that's not that main intensive garden. And we grow some potatoes and winter squash for our fall and winter CSA. And this, we just did an experiment. We've grown a lot of things in alleys with cover crops, and this field I'm just trying to improve. So I took a little BCS rotary harrow and tilled these strips and direct seed into them. And with the potatoes, I take a rotary plow and make a furrow and drop the potatoes in, and I'm hilling them that way. But we were able to, I think the winter squash harvest was definitely less than other years when we've grown just a half acre, a quarter acre of fully winter squash, like nothing else growing in the field. But I think we had a huge benefit of improving the field as we're growing a crop. So if you have space, I think this is a really good option. We use no added fertilizer in either of these, and had plenty for our 150 member CSA. So yeah, this is a picture of our older daughter, and you really get a sense of like the soil we're working with now. It's just absolutely transformed. And I think it's transformed deeper down into the soil profile by laying it on top. You're not just improving like the top 6 inches, you're definitely improving the soil underneath too. This is a photo of the way we're transitioning beds, because I think that's a big consideration in this system. And the most crops are pretty easy. You're just, pulling them out by hand. Salad greens, we mainly wholesale salad greens. That's like our big wholesale crop. And that's the one that's trickier to transition. So we do solarize for a couple days, and the crop is just totally scorched with a piece of old greenhouse fabric. I'm not 100% convinced by that method, because there's a good section in it about this method in Brian O'Hara's book of Tobacco Road Farm. And he has taken a bunch of soil temp measurements, but you're definitely like sterilizing the top little bit of the soil. It could, the microbiology can come back up into that. But I don't think tarping is like the ideal solution. And I wonder if it's better to just run a rotary harrow over. I sometimes wonder which one's better. So what we've been doing that we're pretty happy with is generally using the solarization, but the reality of like the middle of the season, sometimes it gets left on longer than you would like. And sometimes it doesn't quite kill the previous crop, so you have to run a rotary harrow over there anyway. So I think that this is kind of in the realm of small scale no-till, probably the trickiest crop to transition. We're mowing it down with just a little electric mower that works really well. And then, yeah, tarping or rotary harrow probably once a year over any given part of the salad part of our farm, we're running the rotary harrow over. Another huge benefit to this has been the ease of planting. The paper pot transplanter was, really essential for us, but really hard to use in our soil because we have small rocks. It just, like a lot of times it felt more difficult to use than it was worth. And since we've been putting so much compost down, it is just so easy to use. So I think that part of the equation can't be overlooked. Yeah, how much easier it makes life sticking your hand in the soil to transplant something, or paper pot transplanter. So what we're using, I wanted to show this photo on the right. It shows what we're doing before we plant. There I'm seeding our weekly salad greens, and we've gone down and laid seed meal. So when we started here, we were using a lot of ProGrow from North Country, and we've transitioned to using almost exclusively seed meals. And we use like a half to a third of the quantity that we started with. So our farm is on such a small scale. We're rarely growing a field of something. The nutrient needs can be so different. So I've kind of made whether they're heavy feeders or light feeders or no fertilizer at all, depending on the type of crop. And then we just tend to play with that and adjust it, seeing what the least amount that we can get away with. I'm interested in foliar feeding, but also with just the amount of help we have, how busy things get in the season, we tend to do that in the greenhouses in the spring, and then it never really happens again. So the seed meals has seemed like a good solution for us, slower release, peanut and alfalfa. And especially in the spring, maybe adding a higher nitrogen fertilizer like a Pro Booster, literally like 2 cups into a whole bed. And we've generally had really good harvests with that level of fertility. Greenhouses. So what about the greenhouses? We've just been treating them like pretty much the exact same. We've had really, really good harvests of peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers. And I guess the only difference in the greenhouses is probably once a year, we'll be broad forking them because we walk over them so much. We've just been moving to like planting 1 row, and then we're not making so many beds in the greenhouse. We're just planting like the whole greenhouse out. So we're kind of walking over more portion of it. So the only difference is we're not having to broad fork at all out in the field, and we're broad forking in the greenhouse. Some of these photos are a little blurry because they have my my farm cell phone that's in my pocket is like all dirty. But it gives you a sense of the same amounts of compost we're putting down in the greenhouse, transplanting, direct seeding. And we have a couple of the soil tests I sent to Becky that we could go over, but the organic matter in the greenhouses is like 8 or 10%. And I'd be surprised if the organic matter was less than that in the field, because if anything, we've been putting more compost out in the field. So this, getting just really, really good harvest. We moved to, as I said, just planting the whole greenhouse. We left like 2 walking aisles. And this is how we're growing salad greens in the spring and fall, and then in the summer growing summer crops. I was just amazed by this harvest of beans, that just the quantity of bush beans on these plants as I was harvesting them was blowing my mind. And I like reached down and grabbed some soil and picked it up, and just felt like no wonder we've got such good harvests looking at that soil. I've occasionally seen just like postings of really weird diseases on crops, and like looking at the soil next to it, feels like there's definitely a correlation. That sometimes it feels like no wonder that we're having all these problems if we're growing our crops in really poor soil. So we, by soil so much on our farm, we just have like very little pest and disease issue. I did want to mention the reason why I think we'll be transitioning away from composts is that you can have some pest and disease issues from overloading your soil with nutrients. That Becky mentioned, like potential runoff or environmental problems. And I think overloading the crops with certain nutrients could make them a lot more appealing to aphids and flea beetles. So that's one of the main reasons why, now that we have like our system well booted, we're going to try and move more towards carbon mulches and away from so much manure compost. So just a couple photos of the crop quality, and just very little seconds. I think that's how we can kind of be pulling so much food out of this 1.5 acres, is because the quality is like pretty much all first quality. We don't have too much cull. And this summer, I wish I had a picture of it, but I went to grab a steer hoe, or I went to grab another tool, and saw that our steer hoes had cobwebs all over them. And I thought that was just kind of a really nice moment that, as I mentioned, we're front loading a lot of the work by spraying this compost, but then the only weeding we're doing is by hand. And when we're pulling weeds out, we're always struck by like how much the soil is sticking to the roots, how aggregated the soil is. So weeding has yeah, gone from like being one of the biggest tasks on our farm to almost non-existent, like basically spot weeding in corners where, yeah, something has blown in. And we're able to spend more time planting, harvesting, and washing. So pretty much the whole farm crew, that's what they're doing. They're planting, harvesting, washing, which I think, yeah, allows us to just keep on running as a farm, that we're not spending a lot of time doing things that aren't earning us an income. Super healthy crops. Yeah, I mentioned this before, that learning more about how, you know, plants that are photosynthesizing to their full potential are then putting so many exudates out into the soil that are supporting that biology and creating more long-term soil fertility. So out of all the kind of methods that we're using, I think cover cropping and just trying to create very healthy plants are the best way to continue kind of rebooting the system, continue improving on what we have been able to do with the compost. And yeah, I heard a really interesting talk recently about how the mycorrhizae part of a balanced soil is the part that is really, you know, digesting the soil organic matter until it can't be digested any further. And that is what's creating the kind of more stable portion of the organic matter. So how important it is to have a balanced soil. And yeah, I guess the farming this way, we do it for our health. We find that, you know, the flavor of what we're growing is just really, really high. So beautiful. And then it also, I think like the main driver is it gives our family a lot of hope for the future. It just, you know, there's like so many, there's so much negativity about climate change. There's so many uncertainties, but farming this way just feels like such a positive impact, such a positive influence, and something that really gives us a lot of hope and meaning. So, you know, farming is hard, but it's like the deeper why that keeps us going and makes us really sure about what we're doing. Yeah, and I think that's the last of my slides.
Hey, Patrick, so amazing. I want to like be on your farm. So beautiful. Just a quick question, and then I'd love to open it up. People
Sure.
can put questions, either talk or put them in the chat, but someone asked, are you using the paper pot transplanter effectively after any form of bed prep, or does it only work after you rotary harrow,
Yeah,
or also after simply tarping?
After any of those. The one, I think there's a lot of talk. So one thing that's influenced me a lot in these farming practices is just hearing about what other farmers are doing. There's some amazing examples out there. And yeah, reading books or listening to podcasts, seeing videos, and a lot of people talk about just leaving the roots, ideally leaving the roots of the crop you're transitioning in the soil. But with the paper pot, that is pretty hard. So we tend to like rip the whole plant out if we're gonna paper pot. Honestly, we tend to do that most of the time anyway, just to rip the whole previous crop out. It makes it so much easier to transition. But any of those are totally fine to then paper pot into it. I think the soil is just so workable, has such good tilth that no matter what is paper potting is pretty easy in this system.
Yeah, I like I mentioned that class I took on soil ecology, but I had like 3 or 4 kind of farmer take homes in my brain that I probably forgot everything else from the class, but one of them was really like what a high percentage of the soil biology is in the plant root zone. So like you mentioned, like having those living roots in your system is just like essential to like keeping that cycle of biology active and all the enzymatic activity and everything. It's like right around those root zones. So
yeah,
I think we kind of know that, but when you see the science of it, you're like, holy cow, it's amazing.
it's amazing.
Yeah, It's,
Yeah, when a plant is fully healthy, the amount that it's able to manipulate the soil in the rhizosphere just grows exponentially.
yeah,
And yeah, all the things that we're learning about now, about the interactions, like at some point I remember hearing or listening that we're just like walking containers of microorganisms. And the more we learn about plants, they're just like standing columns of microorganisms. You know, they have microorganisms all throughout them, in between tissues, inside the plant, around the roots, inside the roots. Yeah, so basically everything we're doing is trying to support that rather than hinder that.
that's a really cool way to think about it. Somebody, Ben is asking, do your soil tests read above optimum for phosphorus, potassium, and calcium like ours do? We've also spread large amounts of manure-based composts.
I think I definitely, we have those soil tests around, but I'm pretty sure it does read above optimum. And that's why I think we want to train we're on such flat land. I'm not sure what our danger of like leaching into the environment is, but potentially making our crops more susceptible to certain pests would be why we want to, stop using so much animal-based fertility, animal-based compost, animal-based fertilizers. And the decision to move to seed meal was more intuitive, like it felt right to me, but now learning about that we just don't want to continue adding phosphorus to our system, it makes sense to transition towards seed meals and away from manure-based composts, more towards woody material on top of the garden or straw.
And I have some slides to get at that later, kind of the balance of those and that kind of the upsides and downsides. And Hillary's going to speak to that as well, as a farm that's got like 20 years of compost. But I just wanted to mention that, like in Vermont, we're actually regulated. We have I think a different situation than, I know people on here are from not just Maine, but other places, but there's been some regulations passed here that limit the amount of phosphorus that a farm can kind of test for. And Patrick's farm is small enough that it sort of like falls off from really being technically subject to those, but I think everybody's kind of conscientious and aware, and that's why like Patrick's thinking about it, Hillary's thinking about it, and it is a significant problem in our state. The water quality is really a concern. So anyway, it's on our minds. Any questions? Any other questions for Patrick? He might not be here the rest of the time, so you guys should hit him up. Well, Caleb put in a nice, thank you for putting that in, Caleb. I was trying to find that before the talk, but like a better understanding of, or more enhanced understanding of organic matter.
Yeah, this, I recently read a book called The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health. And this book is amazing. It's like a synthesis of so many other things that I've read, and sometimes someone writes things in a certain way that just really sticks with you. And I think that book is so well written, connects soil health with our personal health, what's going on in the soil. It's just a really fantastic book.
One more question just came in. Do you have
well, I see that with the flea beetles,
yeah.
I don't specifically know in relation to using mustards on our cover crop, but that's the biggest pest we have on our farm is flea beetle, and we just cover all of our brassica salad greens. Yeah, so but we had that before we started applying so much compost. I've heard anecdotally that a farm that's been doing this a very long time no longer has flea beetle pressure, but it's just something that, like with our farming practices, we've learned to deal with. Basically, just the second that I'm direct seeding something that's going to be a brassica salad green, I'm covering it with row cover, which isn't ideal because it's staying hot and moist under there. But for now, it's the best that we've been able to do. We've tried to cover it with insect netting, and flea beetles seem to get right through that. They don't, interestingly, like they don't seem to affect the greens that we grow in the greenhouses. We have our greenhouses netted with that insect netting, but flea beetles can still get in there, and they seem to not.
I can just speak to that question a little bit too, is that we've done a little research on brassica cover crops, because, you know, anecdotally what Heather said is kind of what we've all, I think, abided by, is avoiding them on vegetable farms. But we actually found that the pests weren't really enhanced on cash crops by having a brassica cover crop. I think there's a little bit more of a concern with things like clubroot and soil-borne diseases that actually will like carry over and stay. I think you're going to have flea beetles no matter what, but that's in with like daikon radish in particular. So, you know, if you're at risk for those types of things, I would worry. But flea beetles, I think, are just, they're going to love your arugula no matter what.
Pretty much.
Patrick, do you know what size exclusion netting you were using that they were getting through?
We have, it was the fine, you know, we have a couple different sizes on our farm. We mainly use it for the summer to protect our broccoli and cauliflower crops and protect cucumber beetles from getting in the greenhouse. So we still have like pests, I think, are ubiquitous and everyone has. But the flea beetles seem to get through no matter what size, even the fine mesh. I think it was 60 or 80 weight. I was really surprised to find so much flea beetle damage under them, but it's just been the experience that we've had. I see a question of how many inches of compost we need. We've found decreases or makes for no weeding. I think as soon as we started putting down 4 to 6 inches of compost, we were effectively smothering the weed seeds below, and they've never resurfaced because we're not disturbing the soil. So once we did that once or twice, we really didn't have to weed anymore. What was the name of that? The name of the book that I recommended was The Hidden Half of Nature by David Montgomery. He's written 3 really good books. And I can I'll type it in the chat, but his most recent book really talks about mulch and convinced me that we really need to use more mulch. I meant to mention 2 other books that are Maine authors that both live in Maine. The Andrew Mefford's book about the organic no-till farming revolution. This book is incredible and really, was like a catalyst. It outlines, I'm not sure how many, 8 or 10 different farms, and really gave us like confidence to think that like we could do this too, because it shows a bunch of different farms using similar practices. And then the other one was Daniel May's book, The No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm. This book is fantastic too. And they're a couple years further into the process than we are. But if you want to learn like more in depth about pretty much anything I talked about, those are 2 great resources. Yeah, flea beetles do pupate in the soil, Caleb says. Yeah, which is interesting because we don't have flea beetles under our row cover. So I know they can pupate in our soil, but they seem to get like trapped under the insect netting, but we don't have that problem in the row cover. And Hillary said that they use 25-gram insect netting and it keeps flea beetles out consistently. That's awesome. Yeah, because we've started to have some like bacterial spot, especially arugula is really hard for us to grow in midsummer because it stays so warm and humid underneath the row cover. I'll be interested to just keep trying insect netting. Yeah, because also the other thing about the remay that we found, or the cover crop, is like the thinnest remay just gets shredded. You know, like the first time you put it down, it gets shredded. So we don't have any of that on our farm. We only use the medium weight, because it'll hold up for at least a couple years before it starts getting holes in it.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, that's fantastic. It's really great to have your experience and beautiful pictures. I'm excited to have Hillary share. I think her and Patrick actually complement each other really well in terms of like longevity of farming time and scale. So I'll kick it over to you, Hillary. Thank you.
Testing. Do I sound okay?
Fabulous.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you. Thanks to the organizers of this workshop. Thanks always to Becky and Patrick. That's so beautiful to see images from your gorgeous farm. I don't know if anyone pays attention to workshop titles, but I thought it was kind of cute. We had the same workshop title. So I changed it to be Our Soil Health Journey, Digger's Mirth. So here's a picture of our team from last year. Just to give some background to who we are. We are located in the Intervale in Burlington, Vermont. And so we rent our land. We've been on the land since 1992, renting from the nonprofit Intervale Center, which manages about 300 acres in Burlington. And we have beautiful river bottom soil, sandy loams, and silty loams, and we're a mixed vegetable market farm. We manage about 15 acres, 12 of it is cultivated in vegetables and cover crops. And we are collectively owned. There's 5 of us that own the farm together. At any time, we have about 2/3 of our 3 fields in vegetables, and the rest in cover crop. And we do mostly wholesale and a couple farmers markets. These days, since the pandemic, we've taken on a very small CSA as well. But really, our main vegetables are something like 13 main vegetables that we're doing for wholesale. You know, wholesale represents about 85% of what we do. And of that, like over half of it is salad greens. So we're doing a lot of weekly successions of crops that are really just in the ground for like 3 to 6 weeks. A lot of annual herbs as well, and then cooking greens, and you know, and then a healthy smattering of other vegetables that we do in small amounts for farmers markets. So for us, kind of our soil health perspective, you know, I would say that it's, you know, of course, changing, evolving. But generally, we're looking at like doing a very simple cover cropping system, generally with an eye on, you know, smothering weeds and covering the soil. You know, trying to build organic matter, but we're with the river bottom soil, we basically hover it kind of like whatever we do, we're about 2%, their organic matter. Very difficult to raise that number. We've tried and tried and tried, but it's kind of just always around 2, sometimes high 2s. And historically, we've been interested in just kind of like very, again, simple amendment program, we've always aimed for kind of like inexpensive or regional amendments that we apply pretty broadly across the farm. I guess in the last 15 years, you know, been keeping an eye on how we can reduce tillage. And then in the last maybe 3 years, we've gotten really into tarping, in part as a way to do that, part to, you know, reduce the tillage. And so like Becky said, I'm going to focus a lot on sort of how we've shifted. Mostly our biggest priority recently has been to shift away from phosphorus application. So historically, I mean, we had for many, many years, there was a compost operation actually at the Intervale, and we, like Patrick, we were really enthusiastic about putting down compost. It was made down, you know, down the road. It was beautiful compost. It was provided to us at a discount. And so we were putting down 20 to 25 yards or so of compost every season on our cropped areas. That compost facility relocated elsewhere, and so we kind of scrambled to replace that, and we settled on composted chicken manure, which is just kind of like, you know, produced across the lake in Shazy, New York. And as kind of like, that was kind of the cheapest regionalist replacement for us. And so we kind of continued on that rate of application. And then also, you know, we would add sulfate of potash, which we continue to do now, for potassium. I think I covered this before, but, you know, cover cropping for us hasn't historically been for nutrients as much as suppressing weeds, trying to increase organic matter, and like, of course, we always have our eye on making sure we can incorporate the cover crops in time to direct seed, you know, crops behind it. So we're always kind of keeping our eye on something that works within that schedule. Oh, I have this slide just as like, this is kind of an example of, we grow Sudan grass, or we have in many, many years. And this was kind of a challenge. And it's always something we have our eye on, is like, what cover crop can we grow in the late summer and fall and incorporate so that it doesn't give us problems direct seeding. And this is an example of something where you can see the debris from the Sudan grass, which is actually really nice for the soil, but for our direct seeding and growing salad greens, it's actually kind of a pain. And so we've been like trying to experiment to avoid that. But so kind of like coming from that model of like high compost application, simple systems, broad applications of things, really was working super well for us. Like what Patrick was saying, we had gorgeous crops, very high yields, really good weed control, simple systems, everything was profitable, everything was going great. To Becky's credit, and a lot of people in the state of Vermont, like Becky was talking about, there's a lot of focus on water quality and what farmers can do to avoid, you know, adding to that. And so, you know, here, this is a typical soil test. And, you know, we were just really used to seeing these high phosphorus numbers. You know, we kind of assumed, you know, a lot of it was like legacy phosphorus, and we were aware that we were kind of adding to that problem, but I think we also had a lot of assumptions, you know, one of which was like, oh, you know, we're just like a small farm. It's not like, we're not like, we can't be, you know, we're not like a dairy farm with cows on the side of the, you know, river, you know, but so, you know, we kind of had that mentality. We kind of felt like some of the phosphorus was coming from, you know, back when there were dairy cows on our land. We assumed that, you know, phosphorus doesn't move through our soil. And we assumed that phosphorus wasn't leaving our field because we never really witnessed soil erosion happening. And it was actually from like attending these workshops that Becky and others were giving about nutrient management that I started to take a closer look at our soil tests. And I will admit that, you know, we just have had the practice of like, you know, faithfully running those soil tests every fall, you know, and like checking for the amounts, recommended amounts to add essentially for potassium, but also nitrogen, and kind of like adding what we thought the, you know, vegetable crops would need. But I had never really looked at the values over time. And I decided just to do that, just kind of to check it out and see what I would learn. And I saw that those phosphorus levels actually dropped a handful of times. And I'm fairly certain that those were dropping, those correlated with flood events for us. And so I started to think really, and just think about like how phosphorus might actually be moving out of the field in a way that we kind of assumed it did not. So, you know, then we started to explore like, okay, well, maybe, you know, Becky was really great and was like, okay, why don't you guys just kind of think about ways you might be able to pull back on the chicken manure compost, or, you know, like, let's check out some alternatives. And I have to say, it was really hard to imagine not spreading compost on our field. I mean, I'd always, you know, had an eye on like really going for that like higher organic matter. You know, I love that compost is, it's regional, it's an agricultural byproduct. And if you compare it to other sources of nitrogen, it's super cheap. So it was just like, how, you know, I don't know, it felt very difficult for us to move away from that. I think I thanked Becky already, but thanks, Becky, for holding our hand through some of this. But anyway, we just decided we were like, well, why don't we just like try using less of this compost, and just like, let's see what happens. Because, you know, we just never tried straight up decreasing what we were adding. So we just, in 2020 was the first year we started messing around, and we just like cut the application in half. And so we were doing more like 10 yards per acre. And then in the areas, you know, in the areas where we're second cropping mid-summer, we amended with little Pro Booster. And then last year, I really kind of panicked and was just like, we need to have like a moratorium on phosphorus, adding phosphorus to our soils. So we just kind of like in the spring, we just kind of freaked out and we're like, okay, we're not going to add any more of this stuff. And we decided to invest in bag fertilizer. We've tried last year using Nature Safe. It's a 1300. It's basically, we call it meat pellets, but it's like meat, feather, and blood meal, I believe, a blend. And we just decided to, kind of like Patrick was saying, we were like, you know, it was more of an investment, but for us, you know, it was worth spending more money to make sure we had a nitrogen source and to make sure that we weren't contributing to this like water quality issue in watershed. So, so we just kind of went for it. And then we also were like, let's see if we can cover crop ahead of our crops and try to get some nitrogen out of our cover crops instead of just like straight up focusing on weed control. And so we did that, and I guess, you know, successfully ended the practice of adding phosphorus to soil. So we're feeling really good about that. Like I said, it was more expensive. We spent over twice what we were spending on compost. And, you know, I was going pretty, you know, I was running the numbers. I was trying to give credits. I guess maybe we'll talk about this. Maybe Becky will review this, but I was really trying to, especially since we were spending more and we were bringing this like bagged stuff, I was like, well, let's try to add just what we need. And I was doing all these calculations and trying to account for like the cover, you know, our small amount of organic matter that's in the soil, and trying to account for cover cropping in previous years and some crop debris. But ultimately, I think I went a little under with what we needed for that nature safe. But it was okay, you know, like we did okay. We kind of had a bit of an easy year, I think, last year weather-wise. And, you know, like Patrick was saying, when you have a lot in the soil, you can really withstand like significant weather events better. And so we were just kind of like feeling like we just need a little bit more nitrogen, essentially. So, and then trying to do those cover crops ahead of crops, it's just tough for us. You know, we don't have a ton of land, and we do so much direct seeding. And so we did end up needing to incorporate cover crops kind of before they were like mature enough to benefit from them with nitrogen levels. I think, you know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with cover cropping. I think we'll continue to like push doing more cover cropping as much as we can for all the benefits that have been like sort of the ecological benefits in the soil of cover cropping. But I'm feeling a little less optimistic about like cover cropping for nitrogen. And then we did this year experiment with the use of PSNTs. Becky mentioned this earlier, pre-side dress nitrate tests. So this was a great tool for us, and we're going to continue to use it moving forward, just to kind of see like where, you know, are our nitrogen levels where we think they should be at this point in time. It gets a little complicated. Everything's moving around, everything's like the availability, like Becky was saying, it's just like really hard to wrap your head around, you know, all trying to predict it and trying to measure it, because it's so variable based on soil temperature and what debris might be in your soil. But anyway, we are still gonna sort of shoot for, if you see this is a chart with like plant available nitrogen and the timing of it, and so you know, for different amendments. And so we are hoping this year to sort of get on a bit of a schedule of just like taking these tests frequently and just trying to gather data. So we're hoping to prep our beds, and then add, as we prep our beds, we'll add the nature safe, and then test them at these various interludes, just to sort of see like where is that nitrogen at, in part to see if we might need to side dress for some of our crops in a couple weeks, or even, you know, basically after we seed and they germinate, you know, will we want to side dress then? Or also just to sort of see like what are our fields kind of yielding for available nitrogen with this like amendment schedule. And last year, you know, we kind of dabbled in using these tests. And just here are some values that we did in a couple different blocks. So it was just kind of interesting, like it was, if you'll see, like the first value there was like 15, and this is after we had amended, it was in late May. We were really surprised how low it is. We were counseled by Becky that you're looking for basically a value around 30 or over when crops are growing, which was when these samples were taken. And I'm sorry, I think in May, that first value was like a little before the crops. I think it was before the crops were planted, but still it was after amending. So but then we were like, okay, well, there was a ton of Sudan grass debris in that field. And in fact, we saw some of the yields were low, and we're sort of like, oh, maybe the nitrogen was really tied up with that. Other interesting things that we learned from these PSNT results is like the values were higher where we had tarps down. And then in the August readings, you can see like we've already, you know, grown and harvested the crops, so the values are lower like you would expect them to be. So it's just kind of a cool tool, you know, to have in our tool belt as we like muddle around and try to figure out our new like amendment and soil fertility management plan. So I think I mentioned most of this, but our idea is to kind of like apply, you know, use this test, take a PSNT test a few weeks after we've amended the beds, and once we've removed our tarps, and just before seeding, just to sort of see like, where are we at? Are those levels where we think they are? Might we need to side dress? And then we also want to mess around and sample sooner or later, just to kind of like see how those release times might show up with some data. And yeah, so coming up this year, we're excited to really incorporate PSNTs in more of a systematic way. I've really kind of struggled with like keeping up with all of the record keeping. I think historically we haven't been that great with it on our farm. As I said, we had just like very simple systems, and we didn't really need a complicated spreadsheet. So I'm just like working on being able to capture all of this in a way that's readable. And you know, I think we're going to keep trying cover cropping and experimenting with that. And we're going to increase, but you know, I'm not, you know, we'll keep trying. I'm not feeling super optimistic about that, but we want to keep messing around with it. It will increase what we're using for Nature Safe to just make sure we're like hitting the nitrogen levels that we need. I'm also really intrigued by the possibilities of mycorrhizal activity in the soils and how we might be able to encourage that. And we're doing some research with a PhD student this coming season. And yeah, I've just been very excited to hear about other folks who are successfully implementing low-till, no-till practices in commercial vegetable production. So it's exciting to, just like always, happy to learn from other folks out there. And yeah, it's kind of like the more I do this, the more questions we have, the less we feel like we know, but you know, onwards. I will, if I can figure out how to stop sharing, then maybe I could see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Hillary.
pause share.
Should be a,
I can't see my cursor. Nope.
I can stop it for you, I think.
You can?
Me too, yeah.
I'm
Oh,
like, did you do it?
I did that.
Anna did. Thanks
Great.
so much, Hillary. Folks have questions for her? One thing I wanted to mention, and I'll touch on it later, but that spreadsheet she showed with like the percentages of plant available nitrogen, that's been a really big take home for me, is understanding that pretty much all the organic fertilizers we use don't release that full amount in the course of your crop growing in our climates. So it showed 42% for Nature Safe at like 4 weeks or something. That's 42% of the 13% that's on the bag. So we've been kind of toying around with how to account for that in nitrogen applications, and like kind of trying to tie it in with the crop needs and the time of year. And so we'll hopefully have time to talk about all that, but just wanted to address that kind of quickly.
I can see, yeah, a question to talk us through tillage operations from cover crop incorporation to seeding. What we do is we use a disc harrow to incorporate cover crops. Usually we have to do it 2 or maybe 3 times. Before in order to prep the bed, we usually run the disc harrow to essentially like form a kind of a raised bed. It's a 6-foot disc harrow. And then on top of that, we take a 5-foot Perfecta field cultivator, which is like rolling baskets with like more aggressive S tines. And that kind of prepares the soil surface. At that point, we irrigate if it's not wet. I'm sorry, before we disc, we amend. So we incorporate cover crop, we amend, we disc, we run the Perfecta, we irrigate, we tarp. And we tarp for 3 to 2 weeks, 3 weeks in the early spring, and then 2 weeks for most of the rest of the season. And then we lift and we seed or transplant. And then one thing that we've learned, tarping is like a whole other, I could go on and on about the tarping, but one thing that we've learned, like tarps aren't super effective for some weeds like chickweed and purslane seem to sort of really persist once you lift the tarp. What we've done, but we've learned that if we actually, it's like what I just explained is sort of an older method. Now what we're doing is if we have time, we'll do all of the actual bed prep, and we'll water the beds if it's not raining. And then we leave them for like 2 to 3 weeks. And then the weeds all like get, sometimes they're like 6 inches high. And then we tarp that. And that's super effective for purslane. And so that smothers out all the purslane, and then we're good to go. It's pretty crazy. I think Patrick's right. We did have some research, some UVM researchers were on our farm this past year, looking at soil biology, particularly arthropods. And you do see decreased activity with tarping, which tends to be repopulated once the tarps are lifted. So it's kind of like any of these systems, you're like, what's the bigger evil, I guess. For us, it's just saved so much time with weeding, and it's saved a ton of like cultivation time. So we're really embracing the tarps. We tarp all of our, we tarp basically almost almost all of our beds are tarped. And Patrick, we're getting nature safe from Laws, and their delivery is insanely cheap, unless they're going way out of their way. In Brandon, Vermont. Yeah. Yeah, Becky can give a much better explanation of PS&Ts than I ever can. So pass that to you, Becky.
Thanks. No, Hillary, thank you so much for sharing. It's such a honest story, and to be I think that's definitely the learning curve for me in this job is I'm like, oh crap, I don't want to screw you guys up. So collaborating with Hillary and her team is really a total pleasure. So they're very forgiving. So we're going to jump in now into some calculations. I think maybe since we're on the nitrogen tangent, though, I can pop over to that. It sounded like a couple people had questions about the nitrogen. So I'm going to go back to my slides and kind of zip down to there. And then go back to the number crunching if that's okay. People can scream if that's a problem. But this nitrogen thing has been kind of a mind boggler for me for sure. So I think it is a good thing to address while we're here together. So so this is the overwhelming, not what we're going to learn today, but just y'all know this is super complex, right? This is the most insane nitrogen graph ever, only to show that everything is changing all the time. And there's tons of factors at play with nitrogen availability, as Hillary and Patrick both touched on really eloquently from the farm perspective. That's what's happening. So, oh, there's even more. And then we have to think about the crops we're growing, right? So, you know that when you're growing kale or chard or something that you're trying to pick that's green and leafy for a long part of the season, you can keep fertilizing, or you might need to keep fertilizing for continual vegetative production. You know that on the flip side, in tomato production or a fruiting crop, melons shown here on the right, you want to get that nitrogen to a certain point, get the plant nice and healthy and strong, and then you want it to kind of go into the fruiting phase. And there's some, tons and tons of literature on these nitrogen use curves. They've figured them out for every crop. A lot of us are growing diversified crops and might not want to pinpoint each of these things, but I do think it's important to understand the differences here in what we're seeing. So Hillary is growing a lot of leafy greens and crops that can kind of use ample nitrogen relatively steadily, but just keep that in your head too, just to throw another thing. And for heading broccoli, this is the folks in Oregon are really awesome in all of this stuff, but nitrogen uptake and how it's pretty steady, and then the buds start to form. So that's a cumulative uptake. It starts to kind of flatten out there. And then this is the uptake on pounds per acre per day. So it's rapid growth and then it drops. And that's why in conventional ag, there's that kind of targeted side dressing time at about 4 to 6 weeks after you've broccoli that you would want to side dress to keep that curve moving. And then this is what we're seeing more in our organic systems, right? There's a ton else going on. And these are some of the credits we'll talk about when we back up into the calculations. But your soil organic matter is providing some steady rate of nitrogen as the soil warms up to your crops. So that's the first thing we're thinking about. And you've got your cover crop mineralizing over time. And again, that's also weather and moisture dependent. So it's this kind of curve. We typically say 4 to 6 weeks, which is, talk about that more, but one of the limitations Hillary was mentioning. And then organic fertilizers are mineralizing about the same rate, which is why you saw those percentages at 4 to 6 weeks of plant available nitrogen on that chart Hillary showed. It's not fully mineralized yet. It's also why conventional growing can be really easy, because it's much more predictive for nitrogen. And then crop demand is over here, right? That's the dotted line. So our job is to understand how to align those things so that the available pool of nitrogen is not peaking out before the crop needs it. And this is sort of, I think this is from research done in Oregon. I think we're finding it actually kind of due to our cool climate. All of these things are pushed a little bit later and line up a teeny bit better, I think, with crop demand, ironically. But it is really important to understand how much weather and moisture impact these processes. So back to the PSNT, why do we think that's a good tool? I'm not sure it's the perfect tool, but it's sort of all we have right now. So I've been leaning on it and working with people like Hillary. It's like kind of the only way to understand what's going on. And just to reiterate, it's really just a snapshot of that available pool of nitrogen at any given time. It's measuring nitrate, which is what is the plant available, one of the two plant available forms of nitrogen after it's been mineralized. And nitrate is what everything kind of ends up as, whether it's organic matter, cover crop nitrogen, or fertilizer nitrogen, or even conventional fertilizer. So when we're talking about nitrate, it can come from any one of those parent materials. What we're measuring here is just that pool. So we don't necessarily know what it's coming from, but you're measuring that pool. So for instance, with Hillary, we've done some measures on after they've planted oats and peas to see like, well, when is that pool available for plant uptake? You know, you have predictively 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre available from a really good crop of field peas, but is that timing going to line up with cash crop uptake? We don't know. And it depends on what she's growing, when she's planting it, what the weather is, et cetera. And one of the only tools we have to actually measure it is this PSNT. So for typical use, like for side dress, you would take it pretty early on, and that's where Hillary showed as well. Like, you know, for like most crops that you've transplanted, it would be like right before they enter that vegetative burst. So like 4 weeks after planting, or for a direct seeded crop around probably about the same. And again, it depends on the actual crop. And you can see in the vegetable management guide, they give you a little more of a like specificity on like the crop stage and how many true leaves it might have at that time. And that's where that number of 30 parts per million recommendation comes in. Now, someone was asking about before planting, and the thing to be wary of is you can definitely use it before planting, but that's all leachable nitrate. So it won't predict what's available later on. It'll tell you what's there at that moment. If you got like, if you're on a light soil and you get an inch of rain, that's probably going to drop. And I did research on cover crop trials, taking PSNTs every 2 weeks on multiple fields. And we had some really heavy rains that summer, and I just saw the nitrate plummet. It didn't matter what it was coming from. I was comparing fertilizer with cover crops. All the plots, the nitrate tanked after the rain. And then it crept back up again as more was being remineralized. So it doesn't wash away the fertilizer necessarily, and it doesn't wash away your organic matter or your cover crop, but it washes away that highly leachable nitrate. And actually what I found kind of interesting is like in some of the Corn Belt states where they've really improved cover cropping, they're still having like groundwater contamination even from cover crops. It's highly leachable. So we're not as concerned about that here, but it is something to take into consideration. So this is, again, this is kind of evolving. The PSN was really used. It was actually developed in Vermont for field corn growers as an economic tool to help them understand when they should side dress and how to minimize inputs when they could. So like on drier years, you need less of a side dress, and the PSNT has really helped field crop growers tailor that. For veggies, it's different, right? So we're looking at some different numbers and trying to figure out how it comes into play. But this is in the vegetable management guide, the New England Vegetable Management Guide, which is all online for free. And probably MOFGA has hard copies of it, but this gives you a little better sense of like when you would be taking it and what the parts per million are. So 30 is what kind of the rule of thumb is, but you can see it's a lot higher for some of these more demanding crops here. And just to emphasize the impact of rain in wet years on this process, this is from, I guess, the previous edition of the SARE book, Building Soils for Better Crops, which is an awesome soil health guide. But you can see here, this is the mineralizing nitrogen on a normal year. And this is the leaching and denitrification that would happen on a wet year. And denitrification is another process that happens when you have, like, you guys probably all know this, when the, Hillary's Field floods and then it never dries out and it smells bad and it's like squishy. It's just killing the biology and denitrifying. So another way to lose nitrogen. So this is that difference. And that's where you need, and I shouldn't say need, but that's where fertilizer can be a really handy tool. So on a normal year, you might be fertilizing this much, and this is on a wet year, and a PSNT can help you understand this difference. And just on the note of those, that spreadsheet Hillary showed with the different percentages of plant available nitrogen, there's been a few studies that are helpful. One is Heather Darby did this at UVM. It was an incubation study. So in a set temperature, understanding the nitrogen mineralization of fertilizers. And Bruce Hoskins at Maine did one, and out in Oregon, they all use slightly different temperatures. I think Heather's was like, I don't know if it says here, I think hers was like 60 degrees or something. So a little warmer than spring soil temperatures. But what shocked me was this is 100% nitrogen release. None of the fertilizers we're using get to release 100%. So if you've been using ProGrow thinking it's 5% nitrogen for 20 years, you're not getting 5%. It hangs out in the form of organic matter for future years. So after a number of years, you might not notice that difference, but especially if you're getting going and you're counting on that, you're probably not going to see it. The blue line is a clay soil, red line is a sandy soil. Chilean nitrates, as you know, mimics, or as basically a conventional fertilizer, it's highly soluble. So that is the only one that's at like 100% of nitrogen available right off the bat. But that was an eye opener to me. Now I kind of think when I'm recommending a fertilizer, I generally will tack on like 25% more and tell people that, like, hey, this is the buffer you might need. And like Hillary's math she was doing probably accounted for that, but she might not have been getting the credits she expected. This is the stuff Hillary was using, and they were, I can't remember what rates you guys were using, but you were really loading it on and getting plenty of plant available nitrogen from it, as well as the other things. And Careers is the composted, like the pelletized chicken manure. It's like a 5-4-3. So anyway, just to give a taste of what's happening in the nitrogen cycle. Obviously, you could spend a whole week or years on this, but just a little taste. So the summary, oops, sorry, this slide got kind of, I generally assume like 3/4 of the amount from a bagged fertilizer percent. And that the good news, I think, is you can front load organic products at the beginning and forget about a side dress. Even if it's rainy, it should be sticking around unless you're having like a lot of soil movement. So it did, I think for me, it kind of led to a little bit of time saving and fussing in terms of like side dressing, using that PSNT. And then you can, if you can get your hands on something that's a little quicker release, that's helpful. So any quick questions? I guess I could probably see the chat here, but anybody have thoughts they want to vocalize while I go back to the other slides? Caleb.
Becky, I have a question.
Yeah.
In spring, I think nitrogen is a bigger concern for a lot of people as the soil's kind of waking up and still really cold. What are good, Hillary mentioned Chilean nitrate, but what are some other good ways to really boost the nitrogen for early spring crops without adding phosphorus?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a sticking point, right? Because pretty much all these organic materials are microbially mediated, but some of the North Country organic blends are, I mean, I guess it depends on how you feel about Chilean nitrate. Some of the North Country blends have a little bit of Chilean in them. I think they're really well balanced for a continuous release. You can get, I think, non-Chilean, but so Pro Booster or Pro Start, the North Country Organics is pretty good. Nature Safe seems okay, but a little slow. The seed meals actually kind of take off relatively quickly once you get, I think if you get them in like at bed forming time, like you were saying that you're doing, I think that's pretty effective. Just a little warning, as some folks in cooler years have seen seed corn maggot in seed meals. So I know some farms that avoid them for those first amendment applications. If you're growing like onions or sweet corn, that might be susceptible to them. Otherwise, I think seed meals are a pretty good choice. Blood is also a little quicker. I don't know if people have other thoughts, but Chilean nitrate's really like the most rapid, but it's, I don't know. I also think that when you're transplanting with a really nice potting soil around it, you're getting a lot from that potting soil until the soil kind of warms up. And also just another piece of that is like Hillary showed on the tarped areas, if you can warm your soil up some way, that's what's driving that process. It wasn't the tarp, it was the soil warming. So if you can figure out a way to get your soil warmed up ahead of time, you're in good shape.
I just wanted to say we found that you really needed to rake seed meals in, because we've had a lot of problem with them molding on the surface if we're side dressing with them, and then actually like rotting stems of tomatoes. So that's one consideration, but we've had good success with the Pro Booster, just adding a little bit to the seed meals in the spring.
Good point. Yes, the seed meals can be really yucky, and I've burned tomato stems with them. So,
Becky, to add into the confusing mix in which we can all go on nitrogen, but that tarping may also have been limiting leaching of nitrate that was coming out. So some of that nitrate that was there after the tarp got pulled off may have actually come out of the material, earlier on in the process, and then just didn't get leached away.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I actually suspect on the flip side of, in some cases, seeing denitrification of people who've tarped over the winter. They like fertilized in the fall, left it on a little bit longer in the spring, and lost a lot of nitrogen. And the only way I could figure that out was through denitrification, like side by side with beds that they hadn't tarped. So only to say tarping affects nitrogen.
For rapid release nitrogen, there are also a group of products where they're essentially hydrolyzed proteins. So they've been broken down to where they're basically just amino acids. So they still need to be broken down by microbes before they'll release nitrogen, but there's not as much material there that needs to be broken down. So it should break down just a little bit faster, but that's going to probably be more expensive materials. And it's more of like, you might want to top up your transplants with that before you transplant.
Is that like the Enviro line that people are using in tunnels?
I think so. And like, sometimes they're called corn liquor, steeped corn. And I think that's essentially what some of the hydrolyzed fish stuff is. But I see Bruce is here. Maybe he can add something in the chat to back me up or correct me if needed.
Yeah, Bruce is the expert on all this. If you want to pipe up, Bruce, I shouldn't even say anything about nitrogen availability with you here, but go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Sorry, no camera today. Yeah. Yeah, anything, certainly fish, liquid fish is going to be rapid. Usually you're putting that on as a dilute fertilizer, so it's a quick feed. But I think I put in the chat that if you look at the guaranteed analysis on a plant or an animal meal, if it's more than 5% nitrogen, it's usually a fast release, and that will give you up to about 60% total release, as you already put up there in your excellent presentation. And anything less than 5%, like a lot of the pelletized poultry manures have so much carbon in that they release more slowly and less extensively. So you're only going to get like 25 or 30% out of some of the pelleted broiler manures. So keep that in mind. Those are not good materials for a side dress where you want a rapid release. You want to have something that's greater than 5% nitrogen for a side dress material.
And I think the point you just mentioned, Bruce, like the driving factor is the carbon to nitrogen ratio, right, of those materials?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's 10 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio is the magic point or the sweet spot, because plant and animal meals, and you and I have about somewhere between 40 and 50% carbon. So if you're more than 5% nitrogen, you're automatically below that 10 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio.
Great. And yeah, I think the other thing that both Bruce and Caleb mentioned is those soluble materials added like to a water wheel tank or something, just to get it, the more targeted you can be around the plant roots and rooting zone also helps with like the accessibility to the plant. So thanks.
Right.
Bruce.
Yeah. The other thing is you want to make sure this stuff gets wet. It all has to mineralize from, organic proteins through ammonium to nitrate. And, if it's super dry, that's not going to happen. Certainly, we're real familiar with that in tunnels, is where it's a big problem, but it could happen under field conditions like the super, the hot, dry spring we had last year, at least up here, probably slowed down the release rate pretty substantially.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I feel like that's where the PSNT is interesting, because you can kind of pinpoint what's actually going, even if you put on plenty of fertilizer. If it's dry or wet, you can not be getting what you thought. So thank you all for helping with that conversation. I've learned a lot from Bruce's work over the years. And like I mentioned, Heather and the folks at Heather Darby at UVM and the folks at Oregon State have also like offered a lot of great data on that. And the field is different than any of the studies. So it's always going to be like no 2 years are going to be alike for that nitrogen release. So to kind of get into this number crunching, which I know everyone was excited about, but I thought would be the most kind of boring, is how we take a soil test and turn that into some of these real numbers, right? And it's not as hard as you think, which is the good news. And also Caleb helps with this. I can help with it. Bruce is really helpful. Bruce gives you a bunch of information right on your soil test when you get it back. But the quick steps I take are to nitrogen, I think, is like the most important thing for you as a farmer to understand when you're looking at your soil test, because that is not included in the recommendations you're given. And then to look at the other macronutrients and then select amendments. So this is a pretty like roughshod approach, but it I think it provides the backbone of some soil fertility management, hopefully. And everyone's probably already doing this, but it's up to the farmer to identify these management units. And typically, they might be dictated by your crop mix or by your soil type or by your historical amendments, whatever it is. You can break it up as you want, but I would recommend kind of sticking with those units and knowing that, you can, like, this is the farm I used to manage, and sometimes we would sample this whole field as one, and then every couple of years we would break it up into every single field. So you can lump and split based on what you're thinking is your needs might be. So this is kind of the worksheet that fills my brain when I'm looking at a soil test. The numbers on the top are what you get back on your soil test, or what's in like the it's coming from the New England Vegetable Management Guide. I know Maine often gives you recommendations in pounds per 1,000 square feet, and it's simply a factor of about 44 to convert between the two. So I apologize because I have worked through this all in pounds per acre, but I'd be happy to stay on and help people work things out in pounds per 1,000 square feet. But you simply need to divide whatever we talk about here by 44 to get to the pounds per 1,000 square feet. So apologies, but this is what, from like a UVM or UMaine soil test, they say at the bottom or in the middle, 120 pounds of nitrogen, 80 pounds of phosphate, and 100 pounds of potash. Now, these two numbers, the phosphate and potash, are based on your soil test results. So they've taken the book value of what the crop needs that you put in for your crop recommendation and deducted what your soil test predicts would be available that year. And that generates these two numbers. This number is not based on your soil test results. That number is a book value because, as we've just talked a lot about, nitrogen is dynamic. The soil lab is not going to tell you what amount of nitrogen to put on because they don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen with your nitrogen in the soil that year. And that's where these credits Hillary mentioned come in. So that's the first thing I typically will do is say, okay, 120 pounds per acre is like a general vegetable needs recommendation. Do we really need to put that much on is the next question. And where do we get those credits? So soil organic matter, as we mentioned, it should generalize a certain amount into a plant available form over the course of the year. But how much do we credit ourselves? Typically for our climates, Vermont and Maine, I would say 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre for every 1% organic matter. Down south, and I think in the Vegetable Management Guide, they say 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I'm not confident in that. And I even have growers in Vermont who say, there's no way I'm getting 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So your experience can kind of inform this. Hillary might not be getting that because she's on such a sandy soil. So this is, again, a baseline rule of thumb, of a starting point. So you would take that percent on your soil test, multiply it by 10, and that's the pounds of nitrogen per acre you would expect. So for example, if you have a soil test at 2.4% organic matter, multiply that by 10, and you can expect to get 24 pounds of nitrogen released over the course of that season that contributes to your crop needs. The caveat to that is I cap that at 4% or 40 pounds of nitrogen because, like, as I mentioned, I'm on this like wicked heavy clay soil. It's like 5 or 6% organic matter. I know I'm not getting 50 or 60 pounds of nitrogen released from that. It's all locked up. So kind of draw the line at 4%. And other sources of nitrogen, if we were in person, I'd love your contributions to where you'd be getting it from, but is from these materials that we all love and organic growers have been leaning on for a while. In this example, I was saying, well, maybe we're not going to be crazy like Patrick, but we'll put on 3 tons per acre of compost. Something I want to point out is like actually how low that nitrogen number is. So per season, the first season you spread it, you're getting only 3 pounds per ton. It's not much at all. And I often meet gardeners more so than farmers, but they're like, I put on so much compost, my crops still look yellow, and it's probably because there's still not adequate nitrogen. And also, this is why phosphorus builds up. If you're using these materials to meet your nitrogen needs, you're going to crank the phosphorus up really quickly, and that doesn't go over time, whereas nitrogen does. And also to point out, this is why Hillary loves her Giroux so much. It's really high in nitrogen. Poultry manure is pretty awesome for that. So anyway, just a few points, but for the sake of this example, you would, if you put 3 tons per acre of compost, you get 9 pounds of nitrogen, 30 pounds of phosphate, and 69 pounds of potash. So pretty good slug, right? We like compost. And cover crops. This chart shows the incredible potential of nitrogen from cover crops. Hillary alluded to the complications of it being available for crop uptake. And that is like a whole other session to really dive into that. It's really fascinating, but you can get quite a bit of nitrogen predicted from these cover crops. And these numbers are ones I've actually put together from, I've tried to tailor them to our climate. So don't quote these as like, perfect numbers, but based on experience and farmer input. So to estimate that, if you really want to like be targeted with understanding them, these are some good resources. I really, like I mentioned, that Oregon State publication, it's just a few pages, or Marianne Santonio, who used to be in Maine, might still be, but wrote this awesome cover crop handbook. And you can use like the height and the density of the cover crop to really predict how much nitrogen. But rule of thumb, based on research I and many others have done, is it's about 4 to 6 weeks after cover crop kill. The take home for you is it's really hard to get spring nitrogen, nitrogen from cover crops to spring crops. It's really best suited to summer or fall planted cash crop. Even if you're, regardless of whether you're incorporating a fall planted hairy vetch or a spring planted pea, it's either way, it's hard to get that released to your plant much before mid-June. So here's some examples. Early incorporated hairy vetch, you might get 50 pounds of nitrogen. You'd get a lot more if you left it in longer. Field peas, you might get 90 pounds per acre if they're really nice and big. Red clover, you can get 120 pounds. Those are kind of rough examples. For the sake of our calculations today, we're going to just say you incorporate your hairy vetch on the early side. So back to this chart, we just filled in our credits. We know we have 9 pounds of nitrogen from the compost, 50 pounds from that hairy vetch, and 24 pounds from that organic matter. And we just got 83 pounds of nitrogen from things that we've done on our farm. And now we're looking at only 37 pounds of nitrogen that we need from a bagged amendment. And this is like a pretty robust scenario. This is not what all farms are doing, but just for the sake of showing the credits, sod would be first year out of hay. If you're going into a new field, you get a kind of pretty good flush of nitrogen there too. And then we did get some contributions from the phosphate and potash from the compost. So how do we put that all together to figure out what amendment we're going to put on? I kind of generally look at this as a rough ratio to pick out what amendment we might think about. And the rule of thumb I use in this box is that if it's a pretty even ratio there, I would choose a blended fertilizer. If all I see is like nitrogen and potassium needed, I would then target like a seed meal and potassium sulfate, kind of like Hillary's doing now, where you're just using something that's a nitrogen source and a potassium source, and no blends, leave the phosphorus out of the picture. And it saves money in the long run as well to target it. I see a lot of folks using ProGrow because it works really well, but there's actually cheaper ways to add things if you don't need that phosphorus. So for this example, common amendment is 543, the composted poultry manure, also similar to ProGrow. And for you guys all, if a 50-pound bag has 5% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 3% potassium, what would you expect actually coming from that bag? It's not super hard. You just divide it by 2. So you'd expect 2.5 pounds of nitrogen, 2 pounds of P, and 1.5 pounds of K. And then we know it has calcium as well, so 4.5 pounds. And this is not accounting for that conversation we just had about nitrogen, right? So this is just by the bag percent. To calculate the amount needed, this is really wordy, but all I do is I take that pounds back on that recommendation and I divide it, the pounds of the nutrient needed by the percent in the fertilizer. So for example, we know we need 37 pounds of nitrogen right there. And I've just decided, well, I'm going to see how this works if I use that 543 poultry. divide that by 5% or by 0.05, and here's your number. Boom, that's all you need per acre. And you would do the same math in if you're doing this per 1,000 square feet, just with different labels. The next step there, I usually work from nitrogen down. I want to say, oh, well, how much phosphorus am I getting if I'm using this blended amount? Am I meeting roughly what those recommendations are? So multiply back out the number per acre we just came up with by the percent of phosphorus in that bag, and I get 29 pounds. And same thing, potassium. So if we put 740 pounds of that product on our field, we know we're meeting our nitrogen recommendations. And we're also getting these numbers of phosphate. So what does that look like? Back to this. Ooh, good. We got down on our nitrogen. We still need a little bit of P and a little bit of A. Now, you might say, well, what if I just bump up the 543 and call it good? I'm going to use one product. I could bump it up a little bit to get pretty close on that P and K. That's fine. If you want to be a nerd and really do the math, then you'd say, well, I need a little more phosphorus. What am I going to use? Bone char is good. It's highly available. It's going to be more expensive. And then potassium's pretty easy with potassium sulfate or K-mag. So you decide if you need magnesium or not. This is relatively cheap. The bone char isn't. So that's why you might kind of wiggle around a little bit, maybe add a little bit extra nitrogen. And I'm saying that as like the sloppy farmer I am, and not as the like extension person I am. But this is the sheet Hillary showed that helps me to break it down by cost per nutrient, because when you go to the fertilizer store or you're ordering it online, you get kind of sticker shock by the bagged prices. So for example, ProGrow is $22 a bag, and you're like, sweet, that's a good deal. You're getting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It is a good deal if you need all those things. But if all you need is nitrogen, you're paying $9 a pound per nitrogen. If all you need is nitrogen, Pro Booster, it's more per bag, but it's a lot less per pound of nitrogen, and so forth. So this has helped me kind of compare things. And I'm going to zip ahead because we're running out of time, but yeah, so you could compare it to other amendments and see how it goes. I'm going to stop there and just share quickly. Caleb had asked me to share this calculator I built. And it's just an Excel spreadsheet. I'm waiting for the web designer who can like put this into a more fancy form, but it does all these steps for you. So you don't need to pay attention to what I just said. And this does the math. You would enter your soil test information here. Going back to step one, you can add whatever growing area you want. You could do it by bed, you can do it by square feet, or by acres. And your soil test information goes in here. And for you guys in Maine, you would divide by 2 your pounds per acre. It's pretty easy, and it's explained here. And then this step tells you down in the bottom, it does all these credits for you, right? You would enter your credits in and gets you to where you want to be. So it does all that math. And then you can choose each amendment here, and it calculates it out. And you would see fertilizer costs here for your area. And then thanks to Chris, who I work with, you can make a save that line and make a plan out of this, and go back and begin again. So I'm happy to share this. I'm happy for advice on how to improve it, because I definitely don't consider Excel to be my strong suit, but that's the tool that I lean on now for doing this math. And I'd love questions. We can go through an example if that's what you guys want, but I think probably better to stop and take questions for a minute. one thing to note is that I do, like on that calculator, I do account for that, like Bruce's nitrogen availability. So I always tack on like another 30% on the calculator, but questions?
Just for clarification, are you saying the calculator tacks it on already, or that you, when you're using it, tack it on?
The calculator tacks it on for you.
Thank you.
And sometimes, quite frankly, like, you know, I I sort of keep being like harping on like, oh, people need to take their deductions. They don't take their deductions, go through that process, and then you tack on the extra. It's kind of a wash. So if you like actually ignore the deductions and ignore the additional stuff, you probably come pretty close, but it's not as much fun.
Becky, I have a question. How close do you think you can get to supplying your plants with the needed nitrogen and nutrients with a really robust soil life and organic matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the next iteration of like my work, is to get a little deeper understanding of that and to back off of these amendments. I think you can get really close, and you've proven that. A lot of farmers have proven that. I think it's a weaning process where the fertilizers are feeding a certain selection of microbes, is my understanding. So you've kind of over time selected for a certain life in your soil, and that backing off of that, you need to kind of repopulate with different activity. And that's a really simplistic way to look at it, but I think you can mineralize a lot from the soil, but I sort of hit a wall when I think about all the stuff we are removing from the soil as farmers, and how you could replace that over time simply with soil life is a little baffling to me. So I think cover crops are really essential to that process. Something has to go back in, I think.
I think to add on to that, Becky, I guess the New England Veg Management Guide does have a section on crop removal that if folks haven't thought about it before, it's really helpful to make you think about that bank account analogy. How many nutrients have you been pulling from your fields and selling to people in the form of vegetables? And it's going to vary based on your yield, but you are pulling phosphorus and potassium, and eventually, you will need to build that up. There's something to be said about cover crops probably making some of that available from the subsoil or from mineral portions of the soil, but at what rate, right? So.
Yeah, and I think like to Caleb's point, I've been thinking also cover crops having this utility of cycling nutrients to the soil. So really mopping up nitrogen that's left over at the end of the year rather than losing it. And likewise with other nutrients, it can be they can be holding places for nutrients that you've built up over time and prevent the leaching and erosion, et cetera, but also just to like hold it in a plant available zone. And then, yeah, something that's been really illuminating in the high tunnel work, like Bruce has been working on, and other folks in other extension groups around the New England states, is understanding just like how correlated nutrient demand is with biomass. So like in a high tunnel tomato, you've got these like highly crops that are just pumping a lot of foliage and a lot of fruit out of them, and the nutrients have to support that somehow. So I know it's a bit of a false environment, but it's been very like clear that that's like tightly correlated.
I think the area that I'm most curious about is for some of our organic no-till growers that are using lots of compost, similar to Patrick's system. Their organic matter is different than that 2 to 4% that's closely associated with the mineral fraction of soil, because a lot of that organic matter is more actively cycling. And so it's probably going to be dependent on the year and the weather and just the other qualities of that organic matter, but there's maybe some potential there that if you have enough of it and you're keeping an eye on it, that it is a reserve of nitrogen that's going to be continuing to be released, but only for so long. That active carbon, that active organic matter isn't protected from decay. That's why it's cycling these nutrients. It is decaying. So you are removing nutrients from it as well.
Well, I know folks probably want to go. We might have better things to do this Saturday, but I'm happy to hang on for a little while if there's more conversation and questions. But thanks, everybody.